Thanks, Andy and Tom, for joining us to discuss the recent events. Firstly, we've noticed that there's been a lot of infighting in the health, freedom and truth community over the last few months, and this has been mainly focused on the existence of viruses. And while many of us are against the COVID-19 vaccines, and many of the truther movement are too, they continue to steer the conversation back towards germ theory and claims that viruses are pathogenic. So one of the key health freedom leaders is Bigtree, and Dell has done some fantastic work. He helped wake us up in regards to vaccines and the harm. However, recently Dell was asked about the existence of viruses in an interview with Derek Bros, and Dell was reluctant to go there, and he suggested that people aren't ready for that conversation. So what I'm going to do is play some of those clips and get your individual thoughts about what they're saying, and we can go from there. Does that sound okay? Cool. All right, well, let's get started.
Some of our audience, your audience, my audience, a lot of the freedom health movement would say that the biggest story of 2020 to now is that there are no such thing as viruses, that COVID-19 doesn't exist. And this is a controversial topic, obviously. I know you've interviewed Dr. Andrew Kaufman. I've interviewed him a couple times, Dr. Thomas Cowan. I interviewed David and Don Parker, who wrote the book, What Makes You Ill, Why Everything You Thought You Knew About Disease is Wrong. And frankly, I'm not 100% convinced in their views, but there are some interesting things that don't seem to add up. And lots of people are just curious on your thoughts on this. Is this something that you feel is like too far off to take the conversation, or, it's a worthy area of exploring?
It depends on what our goal is, right? Like, what are we attempting to achieve right now in this moment?
Oh, so first up, Andy, do you want to talk about what your thoughts are?
Thanks, Sam. Yes, absolutely. I would like to address this. And, let me start by just thanking Derek for being courageous enough to put Dell on the spot and ask this tough question. I know that he probably didn't appreciate it, but it's an important one to ferret out. And that's really why we're here today. And I want to start with this quote from Gandhi, which goes, "First they ignore you, then they ridicule you, then they fight you, and then you win." And he's talking about a path to bring about change. And the change that we're talking about here is a paradigm shift in medicine and biology, toward the truth and away from the fallacy of germ theory. And it's important to know that what my goal is, because the clip you just played, from Dell said that he will talk about this topic depending on what his goal is. And so my goal really is just to get at the full truth and to make sure that the information I put out there is truthful and contribute towards justice among men and women in our society. And that's really as far as I'm going to go. And that's one goal for everything that I put out. So there's no reason to filter information depending on the goal. I just want to say what is true.
Yeah, completely agree. And what about you, Tom?
Okay, thanks, Sam, Mark, and Andy for including me. And it's not a matter of saying that people like Derek and Dell haven't done good work and aren't contributing. But the way I see it right now is the goal, I'd say, is to stop the tyranny, right? That's what we're trying to do. And the good thing, I would say, is that whoever is the perpetrators of this, and we could get into a long discussion, which I don't want to do right now, as to who that is. In a sense, they gave us a gift. And the gift is they made this particular tyranny, the focus of it, to be about a virus. And it turns out that if you actually go into how do you know whether these so-called pathogenic viruses exist, it's very simple. I mean, they could have made it about, plumbing or car mechanics. These are really, at least for me, really complicated things. But they didn't. They made it about a virus. And I would just say that rather than talk about germ theory or terrain theory, we should talk about how does a human being, a man or a woman, know that something exists. And because it's actually very simple. If you want to know whether a screwdriver exists, you make a definition of a screwdriver, and then you go in the natural habitat of the screwdrivers, which is a toolbox, and you go and find one if it's there. And then you characterize it and you isolate it. You isolate it and then characterize it. And then you see what it does. The same thing with an elephant. If you want to know whether an elephant exists and is real, you go to the natural habitat of the elephant. And then if you can find it and separate it, i.e. isolate it, then you've got it. Then you find out what it does and whether they eat leaves. And on and on and on, even with small things like bacteria. And with viruses, there's no technical problem of finding them. We've been able to do this for over 70 years. And the fact of the matter, as we have all four of us talked about, you can't find them in the habitat that they say they are. And so this becomes a scientific truth, logical, rational way of understanding the world. And it becomes clear to just about everybody that they can't prove that these viruses exist. And since the goal is to stop the tyranny, if you can't prove they don't exist, if you show that there's no evidence that they do exist, which is very easy to do, then all of the things that are done in the part of the tyranny, the so-called vaccines, injections, social distancing, masking, closing businesses, restriction of travel, all that makes no sense. No sense. So you don't have to fight about all those things. If there's no virus, like I say, it's easy to demonstrate, then all the rest of it falls out and we end the tyranny. So to say we don't want to try to understand this topic, it's like if they had made this issue about bread, it would be nice to know how to make a loaf of bread and what flour is. So I think this is really the only issue that will ultimately stop the tyranny, which is, I think, the goal for all of us.
Completely agree. And what about you, Mark? What do you think?
Yeah, well, thanks, Andy and Tom, for those opening comments. And I'd also like to say I would acknowledge that Dal Bigtree has done some marvellous work in recent years and certainly exposed many of the harms being subjected on the population. I was just interested in the way the question was pitched to Dal, saying that, people have various views on this topic, because I think realistically, we're talking about the state of the science in virology, and these are facts that we can check within their own publications. So we're not presenting a philosophical view about how biology works necessarily. What we're saying is that when we go to the scientific literature, we can see that they have not established that there are pathogenic particles called viruses. So I would just beg to differ there a wee bit, calling them views when they're actually verifiable scientific facts. And that was, of course, one of the motivations for us bringing about the Settling the Virus debate statement, was really to show that the virologists have not established through the scientific method that these pathogenic particles exist. And the problem is it extends beyond just the existence of viruses, and it extends into the concept of pathogens in general and the whole of germ theory. And the examinations that we've performed, that you guys have performed, and many others have indicated that these things shouldn't even be called scientific theories. They haven't even got to that point, because they haven't been following good scientific practices, and they simply haven't presented the evidence. So that's where I think we're at on that issue. The other thing is, when Sam and I investigate topics involving biology and the natural world, and I'm sure you guys are the same, we don't stop at some point of convenience. And often we find things that completely blow our minds, particularly coming from the allopathic medical training that we were subjected to. I'd have to say a lot of stuff was hidden from us purposely. And we were completely misled to the point where I will admit that once upon a time I did believe there were viruses and pathogens, and we did also go along with the whole vaccination thing. So what I'm saying is that we have scientifically verifiable facts that we can all look at. So let's bring the conversation back to that. And I sense that Dal will go that way. He definitely seems open-minded, and I hope to see him engage with us on these absolutely pivotal issues.
I'll change over to the next clip. Have a look.
I will say that there's this terrain theory discussion that's going on that I think deserves a lot of funding. I think it's very interesting, looking at, what's inside of our body. I will say where I feel aligned with Kaufman and Cowan and all of these folks is I believe that, theoretically, if I had a perfectly, healthy, terrain that was just immaculate. I once went to a natural practitioner as a kid. Like, we would go to a homeopath, chiropractor. This guy was like a real guru in Boulder. And he once said to me, think of health as like centrifugal energy. And if you're really healthy, that you're a force right in the middle. But as you start drinking Coca-Cola and eating bad food and drinking alcohol, your centrifugal force gets further and further out from you, where you have no power in you. And he said to me once, this person, if they existed, could smoke a plutonium cigarette and it wouldn't do anything to them. I'll never forget that he said that. And it really goes to terrain. I believe if you were focused on your terrain and have a perfectly healthy terrain, I don't believe you are catching viruses and bacteria and things like that.
He's quite the showman. Right, Andy, what are your thoughts about this?
Well, this is kind of a common argument, and I kind of refer to it as a diathesis, where, instead of saying that the terrain model is more closer to reality, or, really it's actually a way to explain when experimental results don't prove the cause of a disease by a germ, right? So let's say, for example, that some people test positive for a germ, but they don't manifest the disease. Now, of course, we know that this violates the rules of logic, that the germ can't cause disease. It violates Koch's postulates, but there will be an explanation. Well, okay, that person wasn't vulnerable enough. So they were too strong, or they were too healthy, or their terrain was too clean, right, to make them susceptible. But that is just a way of explaining away a result that doesn't make sense. So you might as well kind of come up with a force. And, let's say that the reason they don't get sick is because they have a higher health force value, right? And then, of course, health force is just a made up construct. So the truth is that and by the way, really, we can't really call germ theory a theory, and we certainly can't call terrain theory a theory, because terrain sort of encompasses a lot of different theories, really. It's much more of a philosophy about health. But the philosophy of terrain and the philosophy of germs causing disease are diametrically opposed. So you can't really have it both ways. Oil and water don't mix no matter what you do. And adding soap just makes it a greasy mess.
Nice one. Yes. Right. Tom.
Right. Life is not about do-overs, but if I had a do-over, I think in these last 2.5 years, I would probably only talk about one thing, which is not 5G, not toxins, not terrain theory, not germ theory. I would talk about how can we demonstrate or not the existence of these particles called viruses. Because if you can't do that, I mean, then there's nothing to characterize and there's nothing to try to experiment with to see if it can make you sick. You first have to demonstrate using logic and rational thinking and the scientific experiments the presence of these particles, probably in their natural habitat, and they can't do that. And the way they do it, not to beat the same horse over and over again, but it's like trying to prove the existence of an elephant. You go to the Sahara and you grind up elephants and zebras, and then you go looking for toenails. And if you find a toenail, that proves the existence of an elephant if there was 20 or so animals in the mix that you ground up. That's kind of how they do it. So that should be the question that Dell is focusing on. You answer that first, because if there's no viruses, then there's, no matter whether you smoke a plutonium cigarette, which, by the way, I'm not going to do anyways, no matter how, quote, perfect my, quote, terrain is, these are all just theories or theoretical musings about what might happen. If you stick with reality, you try to prove what you're talking about, even if you're not perfectly healthy. As he says, if the virus doesn't exist, it can't make you sick. So then you don't have to go down that road. So that should be what we focus on. How do you know that? And if you don't know that, why don't you know that after 2.5 years? Why isn't that the issue that is the truth of the matter that will set us free?
Really profound. Mark, what do you think?
Yeah, I think, again, Dell's analogy was a little bit incorrect there, because, yeah, bringing in an argument like plutonium has nothing to do with how we respond to microbes around us. So, I mean, like Tom said, I'd never go near plutonium, no matter how healthy I was, that's for sure. And again, yeah, as I say, we're sort of conflating a couple of concepts here. I would also say that the concept of the body being in perfect condition is something that should be aimed for. And I know in our allopathic training, we were taught that there were thousands of different separate diseases that we could get. And I know halfway through being a medical student, most of us have an absolute crisis, realizing how many things apparently can strike you down at any time. And I think it's a completely wrong way to look at health. The body's natural state is actually to be in exceptionally good condition. And I think Dell's analogy there, saying that it's unrealistic for people to be in that kind of condition, is potentially not that helpful, because it steers people back into the model of allopathic medicine and germ theory as well. So, yeah, I would say that also, like Andy said, terrain is a much wider concept. It's not a specific concept involving just microbes. So I would say, yeah, one of the major things we're trying to do is show people that being in absolutely, fantastic health is realistic. It doesn't require vaccines and pharmaceuticals. It doesn't require face masks and lockdowns or any of these things. The recipe is actually really, really simple. Nature's provided us with all the answers. And if we listen carefully, we can certainly be incredibly healthy. So I think, as I say, it's just we need to be careful about conflating the role of microbes with other concepts and considerations in health.
I just want to point out, because I know Dell and many others in the so-called truth and freedom movement are very interested in this idea of a lab-created virus. And I would just say that everything that I'm talking about, and I think we're talking about, holds just as true for a, quote, lab-created virus as a, quote, natural virus. the first step, if you believe there's a lab-created virus, then show me how you have found, i.e. isolated and purified that virus, lab or naturally origin, from its natural host, which is an easy scientific procedure to do. And if it isn't there, you can make a whole lot of reasons up, but the real reason is because it doesn't exist.
Yeah, and I'd just like to add there as well, with regard to the whole lab leak and virus engineering storyline. In I think it was May this year, Jeffrey Sachs co-authored a paper. He's the chairman of the Lancet COVID-19 Commission. And the paper opens with what they state are the two main hypotheses with regard to COVID-19. The first being that it's a zoonotic disease, i.e. came from animals, and the second being it was some result of a lab process. But I mean, I think the problem is with people like Jeffrey Sachs, he probably reports as accurately as he can, but I'm not sure that he's actually looked at some of the papers that he's referring to. So when he refers to the so-called gain of function and pathogenicity studies, I mean, some of these are published studies and you can look them up. And the idea of pathogenicity with what they said was a virus involved grinding up bat intestines and using that muck to inject directly into the brains of newborn rats, and then claiming that the results were the effect of a virus. I mean, in a week or two, with my co-author, Dr. John Bevan-Smith, we're publishing a very large essay dismantling all of this nonsensical virology, including the lab leak hypothesis, to show that it's based on absolute nonsense. Because when you go back to the source papers, they, whether it's Ralph Barrick's stuff, the UNC work that went on, the DARPA documents, the patents, I mean, not one of them, there's nowhere you can go to see the actual proof that they had a particle that fulfills the description of a virus. So, yeah, I mean, again, starting with the lab leak hypothesis, you've got the same problem. It's all based on the same science that we've already looked into and exposed as being unscientific and completely lacking proof.
If I can just say one thing here, again, I'll try to be quick. Just because, Mark, you mentioned Jeffrey Sachs. And I happen to, Jeffrey grew up in the same town that I grew up in. He was a couple of years older than me. And he was my mother's bridge partner, at least sometime. My mother was like a international grandmaster at bridge. And Jeffrey was, the smartest person any of us ever met. He was also my sister's, maybe his best friend or her best friend or something. I'm not sure exactly. So I knew Jeffrey Sachs from childhood. He's an incredibly smart guy. And I think it would be great, Jeffrey, if you contacted us and we could help you understand why you have to go through the same procedure, the same way of thinking to demonstrate the existence before you go concluding that it was a lab leak. And so I can help you. Probably Mark would be better because he's really looked into these studies.
Yeah, cool. Okay, we're going to move to the next clip.
Is this idea that viruses or bacteria only come from inside of you out, that you never have them come from the outside, breathe them in, that they're only exosomes, if you will, that just, I mean, we don't need a whole lesson here. Hopefully your audience is up on this, but this idea that in order for my body, which is toxic because of 5G, because of the pollution in the air, because of the bad food I'm eating and the fluoride in the water, I'm becoming toxic. So my body is creating first bacteria in order to, create an illness that then helps me sweat it out or get it out. And if that doesn't work, my body goes to the next step and creates viruses that come from my inside in a way to sort of light my fire to burn the stuff out and get it out of my body. I think that there is truth that can happen.
Andy, can that happen?
Well, overall, I think actually he is kind of onto something, but the details he mentioned, I don't think really happen that way. And so let me explain. What I think he's referring to is both detoxification and pleomorphism, which are kind of two separate subjects. So I'll treat them separately. So pleomorphism, which is what he's talking about with bacteria or microorganisms, fungi as well, not viruses, because as we've discussed, those actually don't exist. So they're not part of this equation. But there have been several scientists, beginning with Antoine Béchamp, but later on Enderlein and Gaston Naessens, and perhaps others, who have looked under very high-powered microscopes or have done other types of experiments where they've determined that there are these primordial particles, so to speak, in a certain type of microscope. They look like little specks of light, dark field microscope, sorry. And they're given a variety of names, and they have been shown to be able to change shape and turn into different bacteria. And this is very similar to what we're told about how stem cells work, except it's in the microbial world rather than in the mammal world. So, for example, in our bodies, we know that we have stem cells. There are the fetal stem cells, right, that can turn into every single thing in our body. And that's what's in, the early stages of the embryo when we're still in the womb. And then in our body, even as adults, we have stem cells in different parts of our body that are recognized, like the so-called hematopoietic stem cell in our blood system. And what these are kind of a primordial cell that is what they call undifferentiated. So it doesn't have specific features. It's just kind of a blob, and it has the power to develop into any individual type of cell, even though they have vastly different shapes and functions. So, for example, the hematopoietic stem cell, which would be in the bone marrow, can turn into red blood cells. All the different types of white blood cells, of which there are many, granulocytes, basophils, eosinophils, lymphocytes, etc. And then it can also become megakaryocytes, which turn into platelets. So we see the model for this, and Bruce Lipton is kind of famous for doing research in this area. And what these scientists that I mentioned observed is that in the microbial world, there's a very similar type of thing. They didn't call it a stem cell. They called it a somatid or a protid or a couple of other different names. But they observed the same kind of pattern. So it can go into different forms of bacteria, like it can go into rods, into cocci, also into fungal forms, and that these all go through a cycle just like they do kind of in the stem cell pathways that you can see in a regular biology or medical textbook. And so we're talking about that inside of our body. It's been observed, for example, in our blood, that we can see these particles, these sort of microbial stem cells, and that in certain instances that we might call disease or illness, that we can see those differentiating and turning into different forms. And what I've never, talked about that they, do exactly what Dell did, but I think they have a role of being saprophytic, just like in nature outside of the body, that essentially when there's dying or dead a biological material, that they recycle it by eating it and then secreting waste products. And those waste products may stimulate inflammation and secretion so that we can remove the waste products out of our body. But that the bacteria or fungi don't necessarily do all the work, but mainly they're the recycling actors, so to speak. And that's kind of different from the other things that he talked about, but we do sometimes think about one hypothesis about what a seasonal illness, like a seasonal colds or flu, for example, could be, that your respiratory system or your body's air filtration system gets contaminated over the course of a year as you breathe in indoor and outdoor air pollution, and maybe even your body takes waste products or contaminants from other parts and dumps it to the lungs, because the lungs are a way you can actually get things out of your body, right? You get rid of your metabolic waste products like carbon dioxide, which then goes on to be food for plants in the nature's symbiotic cycle. So your body might bring things there to eliminate out of the body. But over the course of a year or years, depending on your lifestyle and how well you take care of yourself and all of these other factors, these things can accumulate in your airway, and your airway needs to kind of have a filter change. And this is what, one hypothesis about what colds and flu are. And all the secretions are essentially the old material, debris, accumulated waste products and toxins being purged out of the body, so that afterwards the body can renew the whole airway system, and then you can have better respiratory function and gas exchange, etc. So this is all of these kind of hypotheses and different topics like pleomorphism, like, seasonal detox and things like that. They fit all under the umbrella of the, terrain philosophy. And they do, need to be tested with experimentation, because we don't know, we have, maybe some supportive evidence for these things, but we really don't know all the details. And so we do need to look more into this, but it's important to also put the same scrutiny that we have about, germs and viruses causing disease to whatever explanation we propose. But it's very, very important to realize that if you want to say that viruses exist because we haven't proved pleomorphism or seasonal detox or some other aspect of the terrain spectrum, that's what you call a straw man fallacy argument. In other words, it's not really what we're saying. We're kind of making the point that Tom did, that in order to say that an illness is caused by a virus or a germ, that you have to first thing show that the virus actually exists and is a real thing. And then you can do further experiments to test if there's causation. But it doesn't matter what the real cause is in order to make that determination. And that's why it's a straw man argument. So it's important to, be very careful and skeptical when discussing these things, and make sure that whatever you're talking about, qualify. Is this something that's an idea that you have, that you've had some observations, or is this something that has passed muster through using the scientific method and can show solid evidence for a cause and effect relationship?
Thanks, Andy. Yeah, I definitely agree about the straw man argument. Tom, what do you think about it? Anything to add?
Yeah, I think what I would like to add is to try to make this very simple and use words correctly. Like, viruses don't light fires, they don't have matches. If you look at the history of virology, the whole thing is very simple. So let me just talk about that, because I think we really need to focus on that as well, which we are. So in the beginning, we're talking once they had an electron microscope and see these particles, the thinking was all the little particles that they could see in an electron microscope, those were, quote, viruses that came from the outside, right? They were viruses, independent particles, independent pathogenic particles. They had their own genome. They had their own proteins coded for by that genome. They were replication competent. So all of them that they could see. Now we go 40, 50 years later, and I think all virologists would agree that some of those particles are these outside pathogenic viruses, but now they agree that a lot of those particles, the same size, shape, morphology as what they're calling pathogenic viruses, are actually breakdown of our own tissues and cells, whether you call them apoptotic bodies or exosomes or cellular debris. I just call them garbage. The cells and tissues are breaking down. You stain them in an electron microscope, you see garbage. My prediction is that in another 10, 20, 30 years, we will have realized that all of those things that we see, all of these little pieces of particles and artifacts in the electron microscope are simply just debris, and none of them can be shown to be exogenous pathogenic viruses. So the field has moved from they're all outside, some are outside, some are inside, and where they're heading is, and you even hear this in some virology circles, we don't really know that that these actually do come from the outside. That's a theory, but we know that they're coming from the inside, their cells, tissues breaking down. So we got to stop talking about, well, in some cases, if you're not perfectly healthy, you get these outside viruses, because there's no evidence that happens.
Yeah. Thanks, Tom. What do you think, Mark?
Well, I mean, you guys have covered pretty much everything there, I think. But just to reiterate for our audience that the word virus is a very specific thing within virology. So we're obviously talking about a particle, a tiny little particle that has physical properties, like it's measured on the nanometer scale. It has a proteinaceous coat containing genetic material. And like Tom said, it's supposed to be replication competent and infectious. So it's not something that the body produces when it's sick and sweats out or coughs out or anything like that. That's not what the definition of it is. And sometimes we find this is where the argument gets shifted and people start talking about different things. And I think we have to bring it back to the very specific scientific terms. And what we're saying is that these particles, which come supposedly, according to them, from the outside, infect a person, replicate inside them, cause disease, and then pass on to another person. We don't see any evidence for that whatsoever. And I think also Sam and I are very careful with the research and presentations and articles that we produce.
But I think Tom in India, you guys are too.
Oh, everyone, yeah, totally.
Yeah.
We don't go beyond what we can see in the scientific literature. So a lot of people want complete explanations as to why people get sick, particularly why sometimes people get sick in groups. And sometimes that can be difficult to ascertain. Other times it's actually right under our noses and we can work out what's going on. But the virus model is very specific, and I don't think we should allow them to continuously shift the goalposts and change the subject. And also, I think Dal said that the body produces bacteria, which I don't think any of us have said that that's what happens. Most of us in the terrain camp state that these microbes are on, in us, around us at all times, and their function changes depending on the environmental conditions. So a lot of these microbes are already inside us. And if we get sick, say through a physical insult to our lungs, then the function of the bacteria that are present already in the lungs changes. It's not a process by which they come and invade. You don't breathe them in and they attack you. That's not what happens at all. So I think, we have to be very clear about the language we're talking about, but and also just stating the obvious. None of us are saying that microbes don't exist. We certainly see plenty of evidence for that with bacteria and fungi, but we are saying that viruses, as described by the virologists, simply do not exist.
I often hear from people, even virologists, well, but this is the best explanation we have at this time. And I would just point out that actually I think it's the worst explanation, because it's the only, if you think, well, is it poisons? Is it the way you think? Is it whatever? None of those have been actually looked at. The one that has for 70 years is viruses, and they can't find it. So that's the worst explanation.
Very good, Tom. And Mark, I just wanted to kind of emphasize that point that you made, because you're absolutely right. I don't think any of us made the claim that these microorganisms come from our body necessarily, although they are in our body and they do come out of our body, right? Every time you go to the bathroom, there's lots of bacteria that come out with your waste products, but they're also ubiquitous. I mean, you cannot swab a surface anywhere on the planet practically unless you've gone to great lengths to sterilize it first.
and not find microorganisms. So every breath you take, they're in the air. Every time you touch something, every piece of food you put in your mouth or anything else you put in your mouth, when the breeze blows in your eyes and ears, I mean, microorganisms are constantly entering and leaving our body. And it kind of makes you think that if they really were to cause disease, that we would just be endlessly ill.
So the next clip.
Now, is it the only way we have disease? That's where I really have trouble with this concept and where it falls short. Number one, they just, this whole...
I think that they're not mutually exclusive. That's the one thing that people should take away, right? Like it can be terrain and germ, right?
What do you think, Tom? Can it be germ and terrain?
If you want, I mean, I would just say, okay, that means you believe germs, let's just stick with viruses. The definition that Mark said, which is the definition, those cause disease. First, you have to show they exist, and you can't do that. You can't find them in their natural habitat. You can't isolate and purify them. The only way you can find them is by grinding them up with stuff which makes the experiment invalid. So in order to say there's both, you have to prove that these germs he's referring to make you sick. And I would just ask Del at this point to show us that, this is all the truth and freedom movement has been saying for years. The problem, they treat us like children. They don't show us the science. They think we don't understand the science. They don't do the proper studies. Okay, do the proper studies or show us the studies where they've proven the existence of this particle and that it causes disease. And if you can't, then you have to admit that that's an unproven hypothesis, I guess, that's been going around for 70 years. It's the reason the world is in the state it's in now, and we need to move on from that because it's not true.
Brilliant. Andy, can there be germ and terrain theory?
Well, it's not a trivial thing just to demonstrate the cause of any disease. And we can throw around conjecture, but once something is been looked at and there's no evidence, really, why would we persist and say that that's some kind of contributing factor at all if there's no proof of it? Now, the few examples that we have where we really know what causes what are really only related to poisons. For example, we know if someone does smoke a plutonium cigarette, we can predictably state what that will do to their body, what type of illness, right? Just like we can with trauma. But there are other poisons as well, right? That we know clearly that if you work with exposure to asbestos, for example, that you could end up getting mesothelioma, right? So we know that particular type of cancer is caused by that particular poison. And we have many, many other examples, and these might not be the most common causes of disease, but we have some pretty, you can find studies actually using the scientific method to show these causative relationships. And if we're going to talk about the cause of disease, that's the kind of level of information that we need. So we can have a hypothesis, then we can test it and say whether there's anything to it or not. And it would be pretty easy to start testing various toxins because we know that some of them are quite ubiquitous and that we're exposed to, large amounts, things like glyphosate, for example. But, to continue to just pretend like viruses cause disease without any evidence when there's been so much effort put into looking at this. I mean, we're talking, I'm sure it's got to be in the billions of dollars for the research efforts and then tens or even hundreds of billions for vaccine research and development, and that's a really important area to look at because, I know that Del focuses a lot of his efforts on education about the danger of certain vaccines. I mean, I think he still maintains that there's a potential of a safe vaccine. And this is really confusing information to look at because you have to use statistics You have to use fudged numbers from the CDC or the VAERS reporting system that don't give you the true and entire picture. Look what we have, all of these efforts of sort of, amateur scientists trying to figure out what's in these vaccine vials. And, it's so confusing because we have all these kind of reports of various things, of different things in different vials in different places. And you really don't have to look at any of this information at all if you understand the fundamental truth that viruses don't exist, and let alone cause disease. Because if you knew that, you would never consider taking a vaccine. And so, for example, if this were common knowledge throughout the population, then right now there would be no one would have any questions about the vaccine because no one would have taken it. No one would have had sudden death. No one would have had myocarditis or any of the other problems that we've seen, likely among millions of people worldwide. So this is why it's such a fundamentally important issue. And we can't just say, oh yeah, this and this and that. They all contribute to disease, unless you actually have, clear and strong evidence to support that. Otherwise, at a minimum, you're wasting people's time, but at the worst, you're causing substantial harm, even possibly, death on a grand scale.
Yeah. And Mark, what do you think? Can there be germ and terrain theory together?
Well, in one word, no. I think if you remember when we looked into this, we sat on the fence on this for about a week, I think, thinking that there might still be something to germ theory, but then quickly moved out of that position because it got to the point where we looked at so many studies attempting to prove germ theory, dating right back to Pasteur and Koch's work. And we actually read through these papers and got translations for the ones that weren't in English. And we were just astounded that they did not establish that microbes by themselves could cause disease. And this has moved right through to the modern era with today's animal experiments that we see. The amount of times they try and use microbes to induce disease in animals and just have absolutely no success is incredible. And as doctors, they didn't tell us this, that you can swallow pure cultures of bacteria and inject them into animals, and they don't actually do anything. There are other toxic products that may be associated with them that will cause disease and damage, but the microbes by themselves cannot be shown outside of incredibly abnormal situations like mega loads of them, or introducing them into parts of the body in which they'd never get in a natural setting. So no, I think, look, just based on the research we've looked at, germ theory, it just doesn't hold water. So no, I don't think there's any need for the two of them to coexist. And I have seen this argument recently with people who can see the writings on the wall, whether it relates to virus theory, pathogens, germ theory in general. And they're starting to introduce this halfway. Well, maybe we can have a bit of both. Personally, I don't think that's necessary. I think the evidence is loud and clear that germ theory it's over.
Cool. Okay, moving on to the next. This is getting into the good stuff, by the way. Here we go. Ready.
My biggest issue is that we are in the fight of our lives for humanity right now. We just got locked down because of germ theory. They just rushed a vaccine through without testing to sort of supplant their control using germ theory. And I have battled that on the high wire every day, showing the flaws in their science of germ theory, where they're wrong about COVID, where they needed to do proper testing and they did not. And I believe we've won. I believe we don't have, tracking systems through vaccine passports on our phones. It was a rough 2 years, but they are reeling. The CDC is trying to admit fault without actually accepting fault. Tony Fauci's running for the hills. And through all of this, as I've been going through this, standing on stages, showing that their own science does not add up to their own theories. When I would come off stage and someone would say, well, Del, everything you're saying is a lie because there's no such thing as a germ. You're lying to people. And I would say this, look, we're winning right here.
Andy, what do you think? Do you think we're winning?
Well, I think that we're experiencing a pause right now, but I don't see, us having a victory yet, because really most everybody went along with everything that was required or, quote unquote mandated. And certainly, there was no politicians stepping up to save everybody. Now, a lot of people did have victories in their life. For me, for example, even though I was fired and left my previous, mainstream medical career, I started something that was much, much better, right? So for me, that was a victory. And I think, many people provided a lot of resistance. And so the government knew that they had to back off at some point as resistance was increasing. So perhaps, we won a battle, right? But the war is not over. I will concede that point. But the way this happened is individual men and women stood up and said, I'm not going to do this, right? And then they started getting together and making a big stink. They put out material, they spread messages around social media, they organized protests, they got together for personal events, for educational purposes, they had online seminars, right? They diverted people away from mainstream media. So all of this individual action is, in my opinion, what brought about, this pause that we're experiencing now, where the governments realized that they could push us so far, and that people are starting to really push back. But I know that a vital piece of information in order to be able to resist this kind of tyranny or all the things that were put upon us is this understanding of illness. Because if we continue to believe the false notion about scary and deadly viruses making us sick, then we might think it's in our best interest to sacrifice our freedom. We might be motivated by fear rather than by truth. However, if we realize that, this is a story that's made up, right? That it's not something from nature that's making us sick. They're just giving the appearance of this really scary thing. Well, that protects us in the most fundamental way, because then the choices are obvious. We don't need to be locked down. We don't need to stop our livelihoods. We don't need to, block our breathing orifice. We don't need to roll up our sleeves for any injections. And the powers that be would really have no ability to move things further at all if we were in that position. The reason why they were able to continue these tyrannical procedures for over 2 years before, and that's not over yet, because they're coming back in various places, like in Europe, Australia, California, etc., that it only lasted so long because people believed it. They went along with it, right? They thought, well, it doesn't seem so serious, but I know viruses could be scary, so I'll just do what I'm told just to be safe. And they were vulnerable to a lot more than that. So, it's not really the right way of looking at things.
Yeah, I totally agree that on the individual front. Tom, what's your take?
I mean, for me, that was a very confusing segment, because as far as I know, and maybe I'm getting this wrong, but Dell has been pushing the lab leak virus theory for 2 years or so, and he said, I think in that clip, I questioned the germ theory, and the reason we're winning is because we're questioning the germ theory, and that's exactly the opposite of the reality. Now, I would say that there are people, and there's 4 of us right here, who actually have got a lot of traction questioning the germ theory, simply because it's ringing true, because it is true, to first hundreds, then thousands, then hundreds of thousands, and I think now millions of people. And I'm not very good at predicting things, but my prediction here is that all the people in the sort of truth and freedom movement who don't go along with this are going to be, like in this case, asked about it time and time again, every interview, every public speaking. Yeah, but what about the fact that they've never found the virus? And so in one sense, he's right. The reality of the germ theory is crumbling. We can't find these viruses. That is, in fact, winning, but that's not what he's been delivering for the last 2 years. In fact, just the opposite. Now, if he wants to change his viewpoint and become a no germ theory spokesman and proponent on his show, that would be a great outcome. And I think all four of us would gladly help him do that.
Yeah, I like that, Tom. Yeah. What do you think, Mike?
Yeah, well, I just think, again, at the start there, Dal said that we were locked down because of germ theory. But I think, the reality was we were locked down because most people believed in germ theory is what actually happened. And those of us who, for example, in New Zealand, we went into lockdown in March 2020. And for those of us that were in the no virus, no pathogen camp, we didn't go along with anything right from the start. Whereas even people who were freedom-minded were still buying into the fear narrative. They were really, really scared. And this is the problem if we allow them to continue on their own terms. And I know Dal's sort of implying that even with the germ theory being the predominant mindset, that we can still argue with them on their own terms. But I don't think that works at all. And with each new fake pandemic that they launch, you're back to square one of dealing with the public being scared, being worried about this concept of contagion, which doesn't exist. And we're really in a frustrating position where it will just be an ongoing process of, rinse and repeat, basically. As Andy has suggested, there's already moves for certain areas to go back into restrictions again. So, yeah, I think I think it's a waste of time arguing on their own terms. And I believe that once the other thing I've noticed is that when people wake up to the fallacies of germ theory and the concepts of pathogens which don't exist, that they actually wake up, they unlock a whole lot of other things with regards to their own personal health. And I mean, Sam and I have seen this with the people we've influenced, is that not only do they lose that fear that something contagious is going to get them, but they actually start a whole new way of living and taking responsibility for their own health, where they no longer look to public health authorities who are lying through their teeth, trying to lock them down, put masks on them, give them toxic pharmaceutical products. And they've realized that you don't outsource your health. You bring it back to your own responsibility. And we've seen some people have absolutely miraculous improvements in their health by simply rejecting germ theory, which has opened up so many doors for them. It's been incredible.
Cool. Okay, we're up to the final clip, which is probably Dell's most animated moment. So we can take a look.
In order to get into a terrain theory discussion, you're asking me to leave the football stadium, that we're not allowed to have this conversation in the stadium everybody's already packed into, that we got to go to a different stadium, put together different sets of teams, and set up a whole new set of rules. Now, that may be what we're evolving to in the future, but if we do that right now, in the middle of this conversation, if I walk into a senator or a congressperson, or a governor's office and say, there's no such thing as a germ or a virus, that door is immediately closed. Those eyes are closed. If I go in and say, do you realize that COVID-19 is not the deadly illness that you thought it was? Do you know that it only has a death rate of 0.27%? Do you think it was realistic to destroy the economy of your state around a 0.27% death rate when flu is oftentimes right in that same range? I'm speaking all germ theory, but that is the only school we came from. That governor, that senator is listening to me and saying, oh, those are interesting points. Do you realize that you didn't properly safety test this vaccine, that we now have systems showing that those vaccines are causing injury? All of that is comprehensible and we're winning in this space. I think it's inane to think that we're going to get to the other side of this attack on our sovereignty by changing all of the rules and the playbook and the stadium and the players in the middle of this. We lose the whole game if we do that, and that's frankly my greatest frustration with this right now.
In other words, the way to get to truth and freedom is to essentially not tell the truth and not somehow going to get us to truth and freedom. So in other words, you know that this isn't true, but you say it anyways because maybe somebody will listen to you a little bit and maybe you can get a few crumbs from them. I'm not interested anymore in what the politicians think or not think. There is going to be an incredible groundswell of people who understand exactly what we're talking about, who know how to use logic and reason to realize these particles have never been shown to exist, and they're going to say, we're going to make our own way, and that's going to create a world the likes of which I don't think any of us have ever seen or could hardly imagine. It's happening more and more day by day. And everybody who doesn't get on this bandwagon, who espouses truth and freedom, will be, I think, inundated with questions and we don't believe you anymore. And that's the way it's going to have to work out. And I'm looking forward to seeing how it goes.
Yeah. Andy, what do you think?
Well, I have a couple of problems with some of the things said. One is, the analogy to the football stadium. That's a game where men make the rules for that game, but we're not talking about a game here. We're talking about nature. We can't change the rules of nature. We can observe and try to understand nature, and then we can draw conclusions from our observations and experiments. So it's not really up to us. And I agree with Tom's point that politicians are not really interested in our best interests. So I don't think it's really fruitful. I mean, the politicians are the ones who put these restrictions in place to begin with, right? They could have considered on their own, oh, what's the evidence that there's actually something going on here? But they chose not to. That being said, early on in this pandemic, I was dragged by some friends who are activists in my local area to a state senator's office in New York. And I was basically brought in to explain the no virus position to that legislator. And I did for about 10 minutes. And he said that he understood and he thought I was probably right. So now, did he do anything based on anything we talked to him about? No, because he's not really interested in our best interest, even though our goal was to help businesses stay open and we were there to represent local business owners in a sense. But he had no problem. He didn't throw us out and call us crazy. He listened to the argument. He asked a few questions and he said, yeah, I'm not surprised. Like he, that this was really the truth. So if you want to communicate to anybody, if you really think it's important to communicate to politicians, you're not going to get kicked out of their office, actually, as long as you are calm, rational, and you have the evidence and a way to explain that they can understand, provided they're willing to be open-minded and talk to you. And that's true about anyone. But if they're not interested in being open-minded, then it doesn't really matter what you say to them. Anyway, it's not going to make a difference.
Yeah, that's such an interesting story, Andy. I hadn't heard that before about the going into the New York State. What do you think, Mark, about?
Yeah, again, it was a little bit disappointing there from Dal because he's buying almost into an argument that the public are not ready to handle the truth. And I mean, it's the same attitude that the politicians and people behind them pulling the strings have, that they only show the public a limited amount of information. So I would contest that that's not a good idea. I think the public are ready to hear the truth, and it's never too early. I don't think we need to wait for a certain moment. I mean, once we've had a look at the science, the state of virology, the state of germ theory, and we've worked out that there's been a lot of fraud that's taken place, that the beneficiaries are the pharmaceutical industry, the political class, the various elitists who are pulling the scam on the world. It's basically to their advantage to keep this whole thing going. So I don't agree that we should keep it within a certain football stadium or paradigm, as Dal suggested. And I also think it's a waste of time like Andy said, taking it to the politicians, because for them, they have influences that are far more powerful than grassroots citizen scientists showing them what the truth is. So, yeah, I would say, and the other thing is the court cases I've seen are either a complete waste of time, because they do argue within the paradigms of germ theory. And most of the cases in New Zealand, well, all of them were argued on that front. And basically none of them succeeded, which is like a double failure. One, it's accepting a false paradigm, and then it's losing even within the false paradigm. So, and there were the court cases around the world where there were some victories. For instance, in Austria in 2021, where they basically declared the PCR as being unfit for clinical diagnostic purposes. But what happened? Absolutely nothing. I mean, that should have stopped the entire fraudulent pandemic in its tracks once everyone learned what the decision was. But instead, these important things are just completely ignored. So, no, I think we shouldn't assume that the public's not ready for this. I think they're ready, and the information is there. And if they look at the work that all of us have done, and the many other people that are working along the same lines, they can find out what the truth is and see a much better path, not only to freedom, but as I said earlier, to much better health.
Yeah, and I think just to finally wrap up for both of you, or three of you, why do you think it's important to get to the bottom of this, Andy?
Well, as they say, the truth shall set you free. You can't possibly make good decisions. You don't know who to trust, what information to trust, unless you have the knowledge yourself. And the only way to get there is to ask the right questions, as Tom pointed out. And this is the crucial question of our time, because this is the main technique at present that's being used to control and manipulate us and to serve the agenda of people who are not us. And this may change in the future. We may be examining the scientific studies related to climate change. It may be some other virus. It may be some other mysterious fake illness. But for right now, this really is the central issue. And once you understand this, then you'll know exactly what's going on in the world.
Did you have, sorry, Andy, any examples of that you could think of, that's helpful?
Yeah, well, I mean, there was one experience that I had actually that where Del and I were both speaking at the Weston A. Price conference last year. And so my talk was in the late morning, right before lunch. And I talked about the subject of antibody-dependent enhancement or pathogenic priming. Now, this is the theory that the people who receive a coronavirus vaccine and then are exposed to the actual virus during the cold and flu season, that they will get a horrendous, life-threatening immune reaction, and the famous cytokine storm will be their demise. And this was popularized a lot by people like James Lyon Weiler, as well as Vanden Bosch, who comes from like the Gavi organization, one of Gates' vaccine research organizations. And so I went back and looked at, now I knew, of course, this couldn't be a real thing because there is no are no coronaviruses, but I wanted to see what they actually found. And so I went back and looked at every single study that was done, including the initial paper that was written that came up with this idea that was based on an observation of some children who had a vaccine and then later got sick. And there are several animal studies, and, you know, in all of the animal studies, actually, none of the animals actually got sick. What they did was they killed the animals, and then they showed a minor abnormality on the autopsy under the microscope, and they exaggerated and made up this idea that you would get super sick. So I went through all these papers and showed people how there's actually no such thing, that this isn't a real phenomenon that's ever been observed or confirmed by any experiment. And then just a few hours later, Del gave his talk, and he spent at least a good 20 to 25 minutes of that talk about this very topic. But his take was that it was very real, and that we were headed into a winter, essentially, when there were going to be massive deaths related to this phenomenon. And people were, you know, very worked up and, you know, in fear during this talk, because, you know, you're kind of imagining that just a couple of months away, because this was in October, that, you know, you're going to see all these friends and family dropping dead like flies. And after this, of course, several people came frantically running up to me saying, you know, Dr. Kaufman, you have to like tell Del that this isn't a real thing so he cannot, you know, be afraid. And but this is, you know, a great example where if you don't examine this fundamental underlying question about viruses and realize that they don't exist, they don't cause disease, you wouldn't even get lost in this research about this other topic, which, you know, is a really scary possibility. You know, we already know that there's a lot of direct toxicity from these injections, so we don't need to kind of make up a fantasy about additional scary things that are not based in reality. So if you were, you know, willing to just believe in viruses and not look at this issue, then you would be subjected to that fear. Right. And then that fear, how is that going to affect you? Is that going to actually detract from your own personal health? Is it going to make you avoid things that you would normally do? Right. Is it going to make you take less risks or make different decisions? So there are lots of consequences for not, you know, understanding this fundamental truth. And even if you're well-meaning, you can still be led far astray into things like fear and confusion. That can be, you know, very detrimental.
Brilliant. Thanks, Andy. Tom, do you have any closing comments?
I just want to reiterate what I said, I think in earlier time in this. The quote, bad guys made a mistake when they made this about a virus, because there's no evidence that this thing actually exists. And millions and millions and millions of people are going to understand that, and they're going to demand a different world, and they're going to demand that their leaders, if there are such things, actually understand that or step down. And I think that's a great thing, because we're going to hopefully take this in our own hands based on understanding the real truth here. And to me, that's a good thing, because you cannot say the problem is they lie to us and treat us like children, and then on the other hand say, I can't tell people this because they won't understand. That doesn't work. Let's just trust the people. They do understand. It's very simple, and we go from there.
Nice. Mark? Yeah,
just to wrap up, I think for people that are unsure about this, the debate that's going on, or perhaps new to it, there's so many resources that everyone on this panel has contributed to, as well as numerous other people in this movement. So I do encourage people to have a look at these resources. Most of them are free, that we've put together. You know, between our group, have we covered measles? Yes. Chickenpox? Yes. Smallpox? Yes. We've basically covered it all, even tobacco mosaic virus. So it's not like we haven't looked into this stuff very carefully. Many of us have been working on it for years. We've got groups like the Perth Group and, of course, Stefan Lanker's work. There's just so much work that's been done in this area. So for people to claim that we're taking this position on a whim or without any evidence is not correct. The material is certainly available. And I'd also encourage people to have a look at the Settling the Virus debate statement. It's 2 pages, clearly lays out our concerns with regards to the lack of evidence for the existence of pathogenic viruses and a simple set of experiments that can be done. Some people are saying that these experiments can't be done for whatever reasons, but that's completely fallacious as well, because with regard to the culturing and genomics, I mean, the stuff's happening every day around the world. All we're saying is that we want the virologists to do it following the scientific method. So by doing it with proper controls and doing it in a blinded fashion, because we think it will expose to the world once and for all that the whole theory or hypothesis, I should say, of viruses is completely incorrect. It refuted itself a long time ago. But unfortunately, it looks like we need another demonstration in the modern era to show just how wrong it is.
Well, thank you, guys. Thank you, Andy. Thank you, Tom, so much for your time. I know how precious it is. I think we've had a really interesting conversation. We've covered a lot of ground. What I'll do is I'll link the Settling the Virus debate statement in the description, and I'll link everyone should be following Andy and Tom. I'm sure you already are, but if you're not, I will link you guys. And we hope to hear from Del Bigtree in order to keep that conversation going.
Thank you, everybody.
If you enjoyed this video, please visit support.dsam.com